The morning of October 28, 1943, dawned cold and gray over the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. A thick fog rolled in from the Delaware River, wrapping the USS Eldridge in a shroud of mist that made the destroyer escort appear almost spectral against the industrial backdrop of wartime America. Lieutenant Commander Richard Hayes stood on the dock, clipboard in hand, watching as the final preparations were made for what he'd been told was a routine degaussing experiment. But Hayes knew better. Nothing about this was routine. He'd been transferred to the project 3 weeks earlier, pulled from his assignment in the Pacific without explanation. The orders came directly from Naval Intelligence, signed by officers whose names he didn't recognize and couldn't verify. When he arrived at the shipyard, he found a destroyer that had been gutted and retrofitted with equipment that looked like something from a science fiction pulp magazine. Massive Tesla coils ringed the deck. Thick cables snaked through every corridor, connecting to generators that hummed with an otherworldly frequency. The ship's entire electrical system had been rewired to channel enormous amounts of power through a network of electromagnets mounted along the hull. Dr. Herman Weiss, the civilian scientist overseeing the technical aspects of the project, had tried to explain the theory during Hayes's first briefing. Something about using powerful electromagnetic fields to bend light around the ship, rendering it invisible to enemy radar, and possibly even to the naked eye. Weiss spoke with a thick German accent, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement about unified field theory and manipulating the space-time continuum. Hayes had nodded along, understanding perhaps one word in 10, but grasping the essential point. If this worked, it could change the course of the war. What Weiss hadn't mentioned, what none of them had wanted to think about, were the risks. Now, as Hayes watched the crew board the Eldridge, he felt a gnawing unease in his gut. The 73 men climbing those gangplanks had no idea what they were about to experience. They'd been told it was a routine test, that they'd be perfectly safe. Hayes had signed the documents assuring them of this, even though Weiss's own calculations showed gaps in their understanding of the technology, variables that couldn't be predicted, energies that might cascade in unexpected ways. Beautiful morning for making history, don't you think, Commander? Hayes turned to find Weiss approaching, a leather satchel tucked under his arm and a manic gleam in his eyes. The scientist had barely slept in the past week, subsisting on coffee and cigarettes as he made final adjustments to the equipment. His suit was rumpled, his tie askew, but his movements carried the nervous energy of a man on the verge of a breakthrough. That depends on what kind of history we're making, Hayes replied. Weiss laughed, though there was a brittle edge to it. Always the skeptic. You military men, you think only in terms of practical applications. But this, he gestured toward the Eldridge, this is something far greater than a new weapon or a tactical advantage. We are reaching into the very fabric of reality itself. That's what worries me. Worry is the province of small minds, Commander. Today we transcend the limitations that have bound humanity since the dawn of consciousness. Today, we prove that Einstein was wrong about the impossibility of unified field manipulation. Hayes wanted to point out that if Einstein, the most brilliant mind of their generation, said something was impossible, perhaps they should listen. But he'd learned that arguing with Weiss was futile. The man had the zealotry of a true believer, convinced that he was on the cusp of revolutionizing physics itself. Aboard the Eldridge, Seaman First Class James Parker secured the last of the equipment below deck and made his way topside. At 22, Parker was one of the youngest members of the crew, a farm boy from Iowa who'd joined the Navy to see the world and escape the endless monotony of cornfields and county fairs. So far, the war had been mostly tedious. Training exercises, supply runs, endless drills that left him exhausted and bored in equal measure. But today felt different. The strange equipment bristling from every surface of the ship, the civilian scientists muttering in German and scribbling equations on clipboards, the unusual secrecy surrounding their mission, it all added up to something significant. Parker didn't understand the technical details, but he recognized the electric tension in the air, the sense that they were on the edge of something momentous. "Hey, Parker," called out his friend, machinist's mate second class Tony Morelli, emerging from below deck with a concerned expression. "You seen the engine room lately? Those generators they installed are running hot even at idle. Chief says they're pushing more voltage through this boat than should be possible." Parker shrugged. "Officers say it's safe. Who are we to question orders?" "Orders?" Morelli laughed bitterly. "We don't even know what the hell this experiment is supposed to do. All I know is those coils give me the creeps. Last night I saw a wrench floating in midair near one of them. just hovering there like it was caught in invisible hands. Before Parker could respond, the ship's intercom crackled to life. All hands, prepare for test initiation. Report to assigned stations. All hands, prepare for test initiation. The two sailors exchanged glances and headed to their positions. Parker's station was on the forward deck, where he was supposed to monitor the primary Tesla coil and report any irregularities. As he took his place, he noticed that the fog seemed to be thickening, pressing in around the ship like a living thing. The other vessels in the harbor, destroyers, cruisers, supply ships, faded into gray shadows, their outlines barely visible through the murk. On the dock, Hayes watched as Weiss and his team of scientists boarded the Eldridge. The plan was for them to remain on the ship during the test, monitoring equipment and collecting data. Hayes had argued against this, insisting that at least the first test should be conducted remotely, but Weiss had been adamant. He wanted to experience the effect firsthand, to be present for what he called humanity's first true manipulation of space-time. The ship's engines rumbled to life, their deep thrumming joined by a higher-pitched whine as the experimental generators began to power up. Hayes felt the sound more than heard it, a vibration that seemed to penetrate his bones and set his teeth on edge. Around the Eldridge, the water began to shimmer and ripple in strange patterns, as if responding to some invisible force. Inside the ship's makeshift control room, Weiss monitored a bank of instruments that measured electromagnetic field strength, spatial distortion coefficients, and a dozen other variables that most of the naval officers couldn't even pronounce. His assistant, a young physicist named David Chen, called out readings as the power levels climbed. Field strength at 30%, Chen announced. Spatial gradient within normal parameters. Temperature stable. Weiss nodded, making notations in his leather journal. Increased to 50%. On deck, Parker felt the air around him begin to tingle. The hair on his arms stood up and he tasted copper on his tongue. The Tesla coil in front of him began to glow with a faint blue-green luminescence, crackling with visible arcs of electricity that danced between its copper windings. He glanced around and saw the same thing happening to all the coils around the ship. The Eldridge was beginning to look like something from a dream or a nightmare. 70%, Chen called out. Commander, we're seeing some unusual readings in the quantum foam measurements. I'm not sure how to describe it. A thinning? Weiss leaned over the instruments, his eyes narrowing. A thinning of what? Of space itself, sir. It's as if the barrier between... Chen paused, checking his calculations. Sir, this can't be right. These readings suggest we're not just bending light. We're creating a localized distortion in the space-time metric. The Eldridge isn't becoming invisible. It's being partially displaced from normal space-time. Weiss's face went pale. Reduce power immediately. But before Chen could reach the controls, something went wrong. The generators surged, their whine climbing to a scream that could be heard across the entire shipyard. The electromagnetic field around the Eldridge intensified exponentially, and the blue-green glow enveloping the ship brightened to a blinding white radiance. On deck, Parker felt his body lurch as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. The fog around them didn't just thicken, it seemed to solidify, becoming a wall of gray-green mist that pressed in from all sides. And then the Eldridge began to disappear. It didn't fade gradually like a ghost in a story. One moment it was there, solid and real, and the next it was becoming translucent, its steel hull taking on the consistency of colored glass. Hayes watched in horror from the dock as he could see through the ship to the water beyond, as if the destroyer escort was nothing more than a projection, a hologram that was losing power. Inside the ship, the crew experienced something far worse. Parker felt his body come apart. There was no pain exactly, but an overwhelming sensation of dissolution, as if every molecule of his being was being pulled in different directions simultaneously. He tried to scream, but he couldn't locate his mouth, couldn't remember where his lungs were supposed to be. The deck beneath his feet was still there and also not there, solid and incorporeal at the same time. He saw his hands, or rather, he saw through his hands to the metal beneath them, and through that metal to the deck below, and through that to the ocean, and through that to something else entirely. A space that wasn't space. A darkness shot through with geometries that hurt to perceive, angles that existed in too many dimensions, distances that folded back on themselves in impossible ways. And through it all a sound, no, not a sound, but the memory of a sound or the idea of a sound, like the universe itself was screaming. Morelli in the engine room, watched as the steel walls around him became transparent, revealing not the interior of the ship but a vast, starless void. The generators were still running, but they looked wrong, their components stretched and distorted like reflections in a funhouse mirror. His fellow crewmen appeared as ghost-like figures, their forms flickering in and out of existence, sometimes solid, sometimes nothing more than vague impressions of human shapes. In the control room, Weiss clutched his journal as reality itself seemed to rebel against what they had done. The instruments were giving readings that made no sense. Negative distances, imaginary time coordinates, field strengths that exceeded theoretical maximums by orders of magnitude. Chen was screaming something, but the words arrived distorted, stretched across seconds or compressed into milliseconds, making it impossible to understand. And then, with a thunderclap that shook the entire harbor, the Eldridge vanished completely. Hayes stood on the dock, staring at the empty space where a 300-foot destroyer escort had been moments before. The water where it had floated was undisturbed, as if no vessel had ever been there at all. The fog was already beginning to clear, revealing the other ships in the harbor, all of them intact and normal and completely real. But the Eldridge was gone. The emergency meeting convened in an unmarked office building 3 blocks from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, less than an hour after the Eldridge's disappearance. Admiral Henry Thornton, a career officer whose face bore the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much combat, sat at the head of a long conference table, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his temples stood out like cables. "Explain," he said to Hayes. It was not a request. Hayes had been preparing this report since the moment the ship vanished, organizing his observations into a coherent narrative. But now, facing Thornton's iron gaze, the words felt inadequate. At approximately 0917 hours, the experimental electromagnetic field generators reached maximum power. There was a visible distortion effect, a luminescence surrounding the ship, and then a United States Navy vessel and 73 American sailors disappeared into thin air. Thornton finished, along with, I'm told, 6 civilian scientists, including Dr. Weiss, who was supposed to be our top expert on this lunacy. "Sir, the readings we collected before the event—" "I don't care about readings, Commander. I care about a missing ship. I care about explaining to 73 families why their sons and husbands won't be coming home. I care about the fact that we just conducted an experiment that apparently violated the laws of physics in ways that might be visible to every enemy spy in Philadelphia." A voice from the back of the room spoke up. "The laws of physics weren't violated, Admiral. They were simply applied in unexpected ways." Heads turned toward Dr. Eleanor Marsh, a theoretical physicist from Princeton who'd been brought in as a consultant 3 months earlier. She was in her mid-30s, with sharp features and sharper eyes, and she'd opposed the experiment from the beginning, arguing that Weiss's calculations were incomplete and potentially dangerous. "Dr. Marsh," Thornton said, his tone icy, "this would be an excellent time for you to tell me how we fix this." Marsh stood, walking to a chalkboard that had been wheeled into the room. She picked up a piece of chalk and began sketching a series of curved lines and mathematical symbols. Dr. Weiss was attempting to create what's called a unified field, essentially using electromagnetic energy to warp spacetime itself. The theory is sound, but the application was reckless. What happened to the Eldridge wasn't invisibility. It was displacement. "Displacement where?" Thornton demanded. "That's the question, isn't it?" Marsh drew a circle, then added several more circles overlapping it. "Space and time aren't separate things. They're part of a single continuum. When you distort space powerfully enough, you also affect time. The Eldridge could be anywhere, or anywhen. It might have been displaced a few feet in any direction, or it might have been displaced a few light years. It could have arrived a second after it left, or 1,000 years. The room fell silent. Hayes felt his stomach drop. He'd been hoping for something like a malfunction, a technical glitch that could be reversed with the right adjustments. But this was suggesting that the ship and its crew might be lost forever, scattered across space and time like leaves in a storm. Thornton's voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "You're telling me we have no way to bring them back?" "I'm telling you," Marsh said carefully, "that we have no idea where back is in relation to where they are now." As the meeting continued, with military officers and scientists debating theories and possibilities, none of them knew that 400 miles to the south, in the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, something impossible was happening. The first person to notice was a dock worker named Frank Sullivan, who'd been unloading supplies from a cargo ship when he heard a sound like thunder. He looked up, expecting to see storm clouds, but the sky was clear and blue. The sound came again, louder this time, and then the air itself seemed to split open. A destroyer escort materialized in the middle of the harbor, not gradually, not fading in. One moment there was empty water, and the next there was a ship, fully formed and apparently solid, dropping into the ocean with a tremendous splash that sent waves rolling across the harbor. Sullivan stood frozen, his arms full of supply crates as his brain tried to process what he'd just witnessed. The ship was the USS Eldridge. He could see the hull number clearly, but it looked wrong. The metal was scorched and blackened in places, as if it had been subjected to intense heat. Strange patterns swirled across the deck. Not paint, but something that looked almost like burn marks, except they formed geometric shapes that seemed to twist and shift when you looked at them directly. And around the entire vessel, there was a faint green glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. Sullivan dropped his crates and ran for the harbor master's office, shouting for someone to call the Navy. Aboard the Eldridge, Parker slowly became aware that he existed again. The sensation of dissolution faded, replaced by a crushing feeling of weight and solidity that was almost painful after the absence of physical form. He was lying on the deck, his body trembling uncontrollably. Around him he could hear other crew members groaning and crying out in confusion and terror. He pushed himself to his hands and knees, fighting back waves of nausea. The deck beneath him felt real, metal and solid and blessedly tangible. But when he looked at his hands, he saw that they were flickering, transparent one moment and solid the next, as if his body couldn't quite decide whether it existed or not. "Tony?" he called out, his voice hoarse. "Tony? Where are you?" A shape moved near the port railing, resolving into Morelli. His friend looked ghostly pale, with strange dark patches on his skin that might have been burns or bruises or something else entirely. "I'm here," Morelli said. "Jesus Christ, Jim, what the hell happened to us?" Before Parker could answer, a scream cut through the air. It came from below deck, from the direction of the control room. Both sailors struggled to their feet and made their way toward the sound, moving carefully on legs that didn't quite want to work properly. They found the control room in chaos. Several scientists were unconscious, sprawled across the floor, or slumped over instruments. Dr. Chen was sitting against a wall, rocking back and forth and muttering something in Chinese. And in the center of the room was Dr. Weiss, or what was left of him. The scientist was alive, but his body was wrong in ways that made Parker's mind recoil. His right arm appeared to be partially embedded in the wall. The metal and flesh merged together seamlessly. His face was contorted in agony, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "The field didn't collapse properly," Weiss gasped. "Phase. Transition. Incomplete." A naval officer Parker didn't recognize. His uniform suggested he was from this base, wherever they were, pushed past the sailors, and knelt beside Weiss. "Doctor, can you hear me? We've called for medical help. Just hold on." But Weiss wasn't listening. His eyes, wide and terrified, were focused on something beyond the physical world. "I saw it," he whispered. "The space between spaces. The geometry of the void. It's alive. God help us. It's aware." He convulsed once violently and then went still. The officer checked for a pulse and shook his head grimly. Parker turned away, fighting back bile. This couldn't be real. None of this could be real. They'd been in Philadelphia just moments ago. Or had it been moments? Time felt slippery, unreliable. He couldn't remember the transit, couldn't remember anything between the moment the ship began to disappear and the moment it crashed back into reality here, wherever here was. Morelli grabbed his shoulder. "Jim, look at this." He pointed to one of the still-functioning instruments. Parker didn't understand most of what he was seeing, but one detail stood out clearly. A chronometer displaying the date and time. October 28th, 1943, 09:42 hours. Just 25 minutes after the experiment had begun in Philadelphia. But if they were 400 miles away in Norfolk, as the harbor master's staff was frantically explaining to them, then they'd traveled at impossible speed. Or they hadn't traveled through normal space at all. Above deck, more naval personnel were arriving, surrounding the Eldridge with boats and establishing a perimeter. Parker could see officers conferring urgently, and several of them kept glancing at the ship with expressions of fear and confusion. Through it all, the green glow persisted, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost organic. In the medical bay, a corpsman was examining the crew members one by one. What he found disturbed him profoundly. Nearly every sailor showed signs of what he could only describe as temporal displacement syndrome, a condition he'd just invented because nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Some men had cells that appeared to be aging at different rates, with patches of elderly skin next to patches of normal tissue. Others complained of seeing things that weren't there, or not being able to see things that clearly were. One sailor reached for a coffee cup and his hand passed through it like it was a ghost, even though everyone else could touch it normally, and 3 men never rematerialized at all. Their belongings were found at their stations, their names were on the crew roster, but there was no trace of their physical forms. It was as if they'd been erased from existence, leaving nothing behind but the memory of their presence. By noon, word of the Eldridge's impossible appearance had reached Philadelphia. Admiral Thornton received the news in his office. The telephone receiver pressed so hard against his ear that it left a red mark on his skin. "Say that again," he demanded of the Norfolk base commander. "The USS Eldridge, sir. It's here. It appeared approximately 3 hours ago. The crew is alive mostly, but they're in bad shape. And sir, the ship itself, it's doing something. Glowing. The scientists we've brought in say the electromagnetic field is still active, still generating some kind of space-time distortion. We're trying to power it down, but the controls aren't responding." Thornton closed his eyes. "I'm sending a team immediately. In the meantime, evacuate all non-essential personnel from the area. If that field is still active, it could—" He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't know how it ended. If the field was still active, it could do anything. Disappear again. Explode. Create a black hole in the middle of Norfolk Harbor. The possibilities were endless and uniformly terrifying. Dr. Marsh arrived at Norfolk Naval Shipyard 18 hours later, traveling through the night with Hayes and a team of physicists and engineers. When she finally laid eyes on the Eldridge, she understood immediately that this was far worse than she'd feared. The ship wasn't just physically present. It was only partially anchored in normal space-time. Sophisticated instruments she'd brought detected fluctuations in the local space-time metric, distortions that suggested the vessel was simultaneously existing in multiple dimensional frameworks. The green glow was a visible manifestation of exotic radiation being generated by the interaction between normal matter and whatever quantum state the ship had been forced into. "We need to collapse the field completely," she told Thornton, who'd arrived that morning looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. "Every moment it remains active, it's destabilizing local space-time. If we don't shut it down properly, the effects could cascade. Can you do it?" Marsh hesitated. The honest answer was that she didn't know. Weiss's death meant they'd lost their foremost expert on the technology. His notes were aboard the ship, but many of them were written in a personal shorthand that would take weeks to decipher. She was brilliant, yes, but this was unprecedented territory. "I can try," she said finally. She boarded the Eldridge with a small team, all of them wearing protective suits designed to shield against electromagnetic radiation. The ship's interior was a nightmare of impossible geometries. Corridors that should have been straight curved at angles that made her eyes water. Metal surfaces rippled like water, and everywhere that pulsing green glow emanating from the walls themselves. The control room was worse. The bodies of Weiss and 2 other scientists had been removed, but the evidence of their deaths remained. Scorch marks on the walls. Equipment fused together in ways that suggested they'd briefly occupied the same space. And in the center of it all, the main generator still running, still pouring massive amounts of energy into the electromagnetic field network. Marsh approached the controls carefully, studying the readings. What she saw made her blood run cold. The field wasn't just active, it was growing stronger. Somehow the ship had become a self-sustaining system, drawing energy from the quantum vacuum itself. It was feeding on the fabric of space-time, and if left unchecked, it would continue to grow until what? She didn't want to think about it. "I need everyone off this ship," she said to Hayes. "Now. I'm going to attempt an emergency shutdown, but if it goes wrong, I don't want anyone else caught in the effect." "Doctor, you can't—" "That's an order, Commander. Get your men to safety." Hayes wanted to argue, wanted to insist on staying, but he could see the determination in her eyes. He'd served with enough brave officers to recognize when someone had accepted that they might not survive what they were about to do. 20 minutes later, Marsh was alone on the Eldridge. Through the portholes, she could see the small boats that had evacuated the crew, now keeping a safe distance from the ship. She turned her attention back to the controls, her fingers hovering over the power regulation switches. The mathematics of what she needed to do were clear in her mind. She had to reverse the field collapse that had brought the ship to Norfolk, essentially running the experiment backward. But the timing would be critical. Too fast, and the ship might disintegrate completely. Too slow, and the field would continue to grow until it consumed everything around it. She took a deep breath and began the sequence. The generator's whine changed pitch, dropping from their screaming crescendo to a lower, more controlled hum. The green glow flickered, its pulse becoming irregular. Marsh made constant adjustments, watching dozens of instruments simultaneously, correcting for variables that appeared and disappeared faster than she could track them. And then, just as she thought she might succeed, something went wrong. A feedback loop in the system, something Weiss must have built in as a safety measure, kicked in and began trying to restore the field to full strength. The generators surged, the glow intensified, and Marsh realized with horrible clarity that she had maybe 30 seconds before the ship displaced again. And this time, it might take a significant portion of Norfolk with it. She didn't hesitate. Abandoning the controls, she ran to the main generator itself and began physically disconnecting the heavy cables that fed power into the field network. Electricity arced around her, and she felt her suit's insulation beginning to fail. The smell of burning plastic filled her nose. Her hands, even through thick gloves, burned from the heat of the superheated metal. But she kept working. Cable after cable came loose, each one reducing the field strength by a fraction. The glow began to fade. The whine of the generators dropped. And finally, with a sound like a sigh of relief from the universe itself, the field collapsed completely. The Eldridge became solid and real and entirely present in normal space-time. Marsh collapsed to the deck, her hands blistered, her heart pounding. Through the porthole, she could see boats racing back toward the ship. She'd done it. The crisis was over. But as she lay there, catching her breath, she couldn't shake the memory of what Weiss had said before he died. It's alive. It's aware. She'd seen the readings, witnessed the impossible geometries of the space between spaces, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her core, that what they'd glimpsed during the experiment was real. There was something out there in the quantum foam, in the spaces where space-time frayed, and reality became negotiable. And now it knew humanity existed. 6 months after the Philadelphia experiment, Commander Hayes sat in a windowless office in Washington, D.C., reading through the official report for what must have been the 100th time. The document was stamped with so many classification markings that the actual text was barely visible between the red warnings that covered nearly every page. According to the report, the USS Eldridge had never disappeared. There had been no experimental generators, no space-time displacement, no impossible journey from Philadelphia to Norfolk. What had actually occurred, the report stated, was a routine degaussing test that had been misinterpreted by some personnel due to fog conditions and optical effects. The strange injuries to the crew were attributed to electrical accidents during the procedure. Dr. Weiss's death was ruled an unfortunate workplace incident. It was all lies, of course. Carefully constructed lies designed to bury the truth so deep that it would never surface. Hayes understood why. The implications of what they'd accomplished and what they'd witnessed were too dangerous to acknowledge. If the technology existed to displace matter through space-time, every government on Earth would want it. If the process revealed glimpses of something else existing in the quantum substrate of reality, the psychological and philosophical ramifications would be devastating. So the Navy did what militaries always do with inconvenient truths. They classified it, covered it up, and tried to forget it ever happened. But Hayes couldn't forget. None of them could. The surviving crew of the Eldridge had been dispersed to different assignments across the fleet, under strict orders never to discuss what had happened. Most of them obeyed, too traumatized by the experience to want to revisit it. But Hayes heard rumors. Sailors who'd been aboard the ship reported strange phenomena following them. Episodes of missing time, objects moving on their own, dreams of impossible geometries that left them screaming and drenched in sweat. James Parker, the young seaman from Iowa, had been discharged from the Navy on medical grounds 3 months after the incident. The official diagnosis was epilepsy, but Hayes had read the real medical reports. Parker was experiencing spontaneous temporal dissociation. His body would sometimes flicker in and out of phase with normal spacetime, leaving him translucent and ghost-like for periods ranging from a few seconds to several hours. The doctors had no idea how to treat it. They weren't even sure how he was still alive. Tony Morelli had fared better, at least physically. He'd been reassigned to a supply ship in the Atlantic, far from any experimental technology. But he'd written to Hayes once, A letter that arrived with half the sentences redacted by military censors. Between the black lines, Hayes had read, "I still see it sometimes, Commander. That space we went through. It wasn't empty. There were things in there, shapes that don't exist in our geometry. Sometimes I think they're following me, curious about the humans who stumbled into their domain. Sometimes I think I'm going crazy. I'm not sure which possibility frightens me more." Of the 73 men who'd been aboard the Eldridge during the experiment, 15 had died within 6 months. Heart attacks, aneurysms, strokes, all officially natural causes, but all occurring in men under 30 who'd been in perfect health before October 28, 1943. Hayes suspected their bodies were still suffering the effects of temporal displacement, cellular structures aging at irregular rates, DNA damaged by exotic radiation that no doctor could detect or treat. And then there were the 3 men who'd never rematerialized. Their families had been told they died in a classified incident, their bodies lost at sea. The Navy had held memorial services, presented folded flags, paid death benefits, but Hayes knew the truth was far stranger and more terrible. Those men hadn't died. They'd simply ceased to exist in this timeline, erased from reality as completely as if they'd never been born. Somewhere in the quantum foam, in the space between spaces, their consciousness might still persist, trapped in a state of non-existence that was neither life nor death. The thought kept Hayes awake at night. Dr. Eleanor Marsh had received a commendation for her heroic actions aboard the Eldridge, along with a promotion and assignment to a new project, researching defensive applications of electromagnetic technology. The official story was that her work was purely theoretical. The truth was that she was trying to understand what they'd glimpsed during those minutes of displacement, and whether it posed a threat to humanity. Hayes visited her laboratory one cold December afternoon, ostensibly to deliver some documents, but really because he needed to talk to someone who understood what they'd experienced. He found her at a chalkboard covered in equations so complex they looked more like abstract art than mathematics. "Dr. Marsh," he said, knocking on the open door. She turned, and he was struck by how much she'd changed. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hair, which had been meticulously styled 6 months ago, was now pulled back in a hasty ponytail. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Commander Hayes, I was wondering when you'd come by. You were expecting me?" "Everyone who was there eventually comes to me," she said, gesturing to a chair. "They all have the same questions. What did we see? What happened to us? Are we going to be okay?" Hayes sat down heavily. "And what do you tell them?" Marsh returned to her chalkboard, tapping the equations with a piece of chalk. "I tell them the truth, as much as I understand it. We didn't just bend space-time, we punctured it, created a hole between our universe and something else, another dimension maybe, or another layer of reality that exists parallel to our own." For a few minutes, the Eldridge and everyone aboard it existed in both places simultaneously. "And what's in this other place?" "That's the question I've been trying to answer." Marsh pulled down a chart covered in strange geometric diagrams. "Based on the sensor data we collected and the testimony of crew members, I believe we encountered what I'm calling hyperdimensional entities, forms of existence that don't conform to our 3 spatial dimensions plus time. They might be conscious, they might not. They might be curious about us or entirely indifferent. We simply don't have the framework to understand them." Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. "Dr. Weiss said something before he died. He said it's aware." "I know. I've thought about that constantly." Marsh turned to face him directly. "Commander, I need to tell you something that isn't in any official report. When I was shutting down the field generators aboard the Eldridge in those final moments before the field collapsed, I felt something. Not saw, not heard, but felt. A presence, vast and incomprehensible, turning its attention toward me, toward us, toward Earth." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that we may have made a terrible mistake. We opened a door, Commander, and we've attracted the attention of something on the other side. I don't know if it's malevolent or benign. I don't know if it even perceives us as meaningful entities or just as interesting patterns in the quantum noise. But I know it's watching, and I know that every night when I close my eyes, I can still feel it out there, pressing against the membrane of our reality, curious about the creatures that briefly touched its domain." Hayes sat in silence, processing her words. Finally, he asked the question that had been haunting him since that morning in Philadelphia. "Will it try to come through?" "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe we'll be the ones who go to it." Marsh gestured to a stack of reports on her desk. "I've been tracking anomalies worldwide, unexplained disappearances. Objects materializing in impossible locations, people reporting lost time and strange visions. The incidents are rare, but they're increasing in frequency. It's as if the barrier between dimensions, which has always been stable, is now showing cracks. Because of what we did. Because of what we proved was possible. The universe is learning, Commander. Reality itself is adapting to the fact that the membrane can be punctured. And once you open Pandora's box, she didn't need to finish the sentence. 3,000 miles away, in a small town in Iowa, James Parker sat in his childhood bedroom, staring at his hands. They were flickering again, becoming transparent, and he could see the wooden floorboards through his fingers. The episodes were getting more frequent. Last week, he'd phased out completely for 6 hours, trapped in a twilight state where he could see and hear everything around him but couldn't interact with the physical world. His mother had found him afterward, solid again, curled on the floor and sobbing. The doctors said there was nothing they could do. His condition was unique, unprecedented. They could document it, study it, write papers about it for classified journals, but they couldn't cure it. Every day, Parker felt himself becoming less real, less anchored to this universe. Sometimes he wondered if he was slowly being pulled back to that space between spaces, his body trying to return to the quantum state it had briefly occupied aboard the Eldridge. He looked at the photographs on his dresser, family pictures from before the Navy, before the experiment, before his life had become this waking nightmare. In one photo, he was grinning next to his father, both of them holding fishing rods, a string of base hanging between them. That James Parker seemed like a different person, someone from a different universe entirely. Maybe he was. The philosophical implications of what had happened tormented Parker more than the physical effects. If he'd been in 2 places, 2 states, simultaneously during the displacement, which version was the real James Parker? Was he the one who'd rematerialized in Norfolk? Or was he the one still trapped in that hyperdimensional space, experiencing an eternity of non-existence? Was his consciousness even continuous anymore? Or was he a copy, a quantum echo of the original who'd been destroyed when the field activated? These weren't abstract questions. They felt vitally, desperately important. Because if he wasn't the real James Parker, then what was the point of going on? His mother called from downstairs, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness. "James, dinner's ready." He looked down at his hands. Solid again, for now. With effort, he pushed himself up from the bed and made his way downstairs, each step careful and deliberate, as if he might phase through the floor at any moment. At the dinner table, his parents tried to maintain normalcy. His father talked about the farm, about crop yields and market prices. His mother asked about his plans, whether he'd thought about going back to school, maybe finding a girl to settle down with. They didn't mention the Navy, or the incident that had brought him home early. That was classified. They'd been told he had epilepsy, and been encouraged not to press for details. But they knew something was wrong. Parker could see it in their eyes, in the way they watched him when they thought he wasn't looking. They could see him flickering sometimes, he was sure of it. They just didn't know how to acknowledge something so impossible. After dinner, Parker excused himself and walked out to the barn. The winter air was cold and sharp, grounding him in physical sensation. He stood in the hayloft, looking out at the empty fields, and tried to imagine a future. College, a job, marriage, children, all the normal things that normal people did. But he wasn't normal anymore. None of them were. The crew of the Eldridge had been scattered across the world, but they were still connected by the invisible thread of shared trauma. Parker had received letters from some of them, carefully worded to avoid classification violations but clear enough in their meaning. Tony Morelli wrote about nightmares. Another sailor described objects in his quarters moving on their own, always when he wasn't looking directly at them. A third reported that his reflection sometimes appeared a few seconds before he did, as if his image was out of sync with his physical body. They were all broken in different ways, their bodies and minds bearing scars that no one else could see or understand. And the worst part, the thing that haunted Parker more than anything, was the knowledge that it had all been for nothing. The experiment hadn't been a success. It hadn't given the Navy a tactical advantage or changed the course of the war. It had simply proven that human beings weren't meant to pierce the veil of reality, that some boundaries existed for good reason. Back in Washington, Hayes was summoned to a meeting with Admiral Thornton and several men in civilian suits who introduced themselves with obvious aliases. They wanted to know if Marsh's research could be weaponized, if the displacement effect could be controlled, refined, turned into something useful. Hayes stared at them in disbelief. Haven't you read the reports? We lost good men. The technology is fundamentally unstable. Every calculation suggests that attempting it again would be even more dangerous. But possible? One of the suits asked. Theoretically, yes, but then we continue research. The war won't last forever, Commander, but the geopolitical competition will. If we can master this technology before the Soviets or anyone else, it could ensure American dominance for generations. Hayes wanted to refuse, wanted to tell them they were insane. But he was a military officer, and he'd learned long ago that personal objections rarely mattered when national security was invoked. After the meeting, he returned to his office and found a telegram waiting for him. It was from James Parker's mother, requesting that Hayes contact her. With a sense of dread, he placed the call. Mrs. Parker, this is Commander Hayes. Oh, Commander. Her voice was thick with tears. I didn't know who else to call. He's gone. Hayes's heart sank. Gone? What happened? This morning, I went to wake him for breakfast and his room was empty. But not just empty. It was like he'd never been there. His bed wasn't slept in. His clothes weren't disturbed. It was as if he'd just faded away. Hayes closed his eyes, understanding immediately what had happened. Parker had finally been pulled back completely into that quantum state. His tenuous connection to normal space-time severed. He was gone. Not dead, but erased, joining the 3 crew members who'd never rematerialized. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Parker. I know this doesn't make sense, and I can't explain what happened to James, but please believe me when I say that your son was brave. What he experienced, what he endured, very few people could have handled. Will we ever see him again? Hayes wanted to say yes, wanted to offer her hope, but he'd never lied to a mother about her son before, and he wasn't going to start now. I don't know, he said honestly. I truly don't know. After hanging up, Hayes sat in the darkness of his office, thinking about all the young men who'd boarded the Eldridge that October morning. They'd trusted their officers, trusted their government, trusted that the experiment would be safe, and that trust had cost them everything. 5 years later, in 1948, Dr. Eleanor Marsh published a classified paper titled Quantum Barriers and Hyperdimensional Incursion Events, a Theoretical Framework. In it, she laid out her theory that the Philadelphia experiment had created a permanent weak point in the dimensional membrane, a scar in space-time that would never fully heal. Her calculations suggested that more incidents would occur near Philadelphia and Norfolk, spontaneous breaches where objects or even people might slip between dimensions. The Navy classified the paper at the highest levels and quietly began monitoring both locations. Over the following decades, they documented hundreds of anomalies. A house that appeared overnight in a Philadelphia suburb, fully furnished but with architectural styles that wouldn't exist for another 20 years. A World War II sailor found wandering the Norfolk docks in 1963, insisting it was still 1943, and showing no signs of having aged. Objects appearing and disappearing, temporal loops, causality violations. The Eldridge itself was quietly decommissioned and sold to Greece in 1951, where it served in their navy under a different name. But sailors aboard the ship reported strange phenomena even years later. The ghost of a man with burn scars wandering the corridors, equipment that activated on its own, a persistent green glow that appeared during electrical storms. Commander Hayes remained in the Navy until his retirement in 1958. He never spoke publicly about the Philadelphia experiment, adhering to the classification orders until his death in 1976. But in his private journals, discovered by his family after he passed, he wrote extensively about that day in 1943 and what it had taught him about the fragility of reality itself. One entry, dated December 7, 1963, read, 20 years ago today, we opened a door we didn't understand and couldn't close. I've spent 2 decades wondering if we should have refused, if we should have recognized the hubris in believing we could manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe without consequence. But I've come to realize that someone, somewhere, would have attempted it eventually. Human curiosity is inexhaustible, and our capacity for recklessness in pursuit of knowledge is perhaps our defining characteristic. What haunts me isn't that we did the experiment. It's that we learned so little from its failure. The classified projects continue. Other scientists, other officers, other young men are being exposed to forces they don't understand. And somewhere in the quantum foam, in the spaces between spaces, something vast and incomprehensible continues to watch, waiting for the next time we pierce the veil. I fear that next time, we won't be so lucky. Dr. Marsh continued her research until her retirement in 1971. Her final classified report, submitted to a government committee that officially didn't exist, contained a warning that was largely ignored. The Philadelphia experiment demonstrated conclusively that our universe is not as stable or as isolated as we believed. The barriers between dimensions are permeable under the right conditions, and what exists beyond those barriers appears to be aware of us. Further attempts to exploit space-time manipulation technology should be approached with extreme caution, if attempted at all. We are children playing with forces that could unmake reality itself. The fact that we survived the first attempt should not be interpreted as evidence that we'll survive the next. As for the crew of the Eldridge, those who survived carried their scars in silence. Some managed to build relatively normal lives, the effects of their displacement fading over time. Others, like James Parker, simply faded away, their connection to normal space-time too damaged to maintain. A few went public with their stories in later years, once the most restrictive classification periods had expired, but they were dismissed as cranks, conspiracy theorists, men whose minds had been damaged by trauma and who'd constructed elaborate fantasies to explain their psychological injuries. The truth remained classified, buried under layers of official denial and bureaucratic obstruction. The USS Eldridge's strange journey from Philadelphia to Norfolk, the hyperdimensional space it had traversed, the entities that existed in that realm, all of it was relegated to the realm of urban legend and conspiracy theory. But in certain corners of the military-industrial complex, in laboratories hidden behind innocuous cover names, the research continued. Scientists studied Marsh's equations, attempted to refine Weiss's calculations, built newer and more sophisticated versions of the electromagnetic generators that had powered the original experiment. They told themselves they were being more careful, more methodical, that they'd learned from the mistakes of 1943. They were wrong. In 1984, a research facility in Nevada conducting experiments with high-energy electromagnetics experienced an equipment malfunction that resulted in the disappearance of the entire laboratory complex for 17 minutes. When it rematerialized, 3 of the 7 scientists inside were dead, and the survivors reported experiencing something very similar to what the Eldridge crew had described 4 decades earlier. The incident was classified, the facility was demolished, and the research program was officially terminated. Unofficially, of course, it continued, because that's what humans do. We push boundaries. We test limits. We look into the abyss and, when it looks back, we convince ourselves that we can control it, understand it, harness it for our own purposes. The ship vanished from Philadelphia in 1943 and reappeared moments later 400 miles away. But the real journey, the journey through the space between spaces, through dimensions our brains weren't designed to perceive, into the awareness of entities whose existence challenges everything we understand about reality, that journey never ended. For the crew of the Eldridge, for Dr. Marsh, for Commander Hayes, and for all the others touched by the experiment, the displacement was permanent. They'd seen beyond the veil, glimpsed the architecture of reality itself, and that knowledge had changed them irrevocably. The ship came back, but the men who served aboard it never truly returned from where they'd been. Part of them remained forever in that hyperdimensional space, trapped between moments, existing in the quantum foam where matter and energy and consciousness blur together into something we have no words to describe. And somewhere out there, in the spaces between spaces, something vast and unknowable continues to watch, waiting for the next time humanity tears a hole in the fabric of reality. Because there will be a next time. There always is. That's not a prediction. It's simply understanding human nature, and perhaps understanding the universe's response to our relentless curiosity.